We have Talat Ahmed, who is a historian of South Asia and teaches history at Edinburgh University. She's also a member of the ISJ editorial board and a member of Edinburgh SWP. The meeting, as I'm sure you are more than aware, is India and Modi after the elections.
Okay, so general elections have obviously been a running theme of this year's Marxism, and as we await the result of the French elections, the second round of it, I hope that the pollsters get it wrong in the same way that they called the Indian election result wrong. Everybody was shocked by that result, including me, but of course the people that were most shocked by this were the incumbent ruling party, the BJP, and particularly Modi. The arrogance, the hubris of the BJP was absolutely extraordinary in the run-up to this general election. Modi himself talked and gave an interview to a leading Indian news outlet saying that Modi will win thrice, maybe 5 times, maybe even 7 times, because I've got millions of people behind me. And yet the reality was that although the BJP were the winners in terms of getting the majority of the poll, they did not have the outright majority that they had enjoyed in the previous 5 years. They lost 63 seats, which is absolutely extraordinary from their result in 2019. And the reason why I think this is quite significant is because all the way across the globe we've been witnessing the growth of the far right. Obviously, we will wait to see what happens across the Channel with the French results. But even in Britain, although the Labour Party won, the fact that we've had the growth of Reform, UK, and the far right, and of course in the autumn this year, heaven knows what the result and the news will bring from across the pond in the United States. What is one of the things that's most significant about the Indian election result is that this veneer that somehow Modi was invincible, that he was unstoppable, has really taken quite a sharp dent. And I think that's obviously something that we as socialists have to celebrate, because it really has punctured his bubble and the bubble of the BJP. And we have to remember that they were predicting that they were going to get almost 400 seats. So to come out with the result of 240 seats, down by 63, is absolutely extraordinary. The other thing that's significant about this is that whilst we're used to talking about, hard right politicians, the far right like Trump, Farage, Le Pen, etc., we have to remind ourselves that the first electoral success of a hard right politician was India, right? In 2014, when Modi led the BJP to their first electoral success. And therefore, in that sense, he has really paved the way in terms of an electoral breakthrough for the likes of Trump, Le Pen, Maloney, and so on and so forth. So it's important for us to bear in mind that, yes, Modi is not invincible, and that there can be a defeat for them. And I thought it was really quite amusing that the leading Indian pollster, on the day that the result was announced, burst into tears on TV, because the entire establishment inside of the Indian state had bought in to the bullshit of the Modi regime, that this was going to be a runaway success, everything was now completely destroyed, and that Modi was going to be there into the next millennium, and so on and so forth. So that was really quite hilarious. The other reason why the result is significant is because we have seen the return of a parliamentary opposition. And if you follow what goes on in India as closely as I do, this was almost seen as nigh on impossible 5 years ago. And yet we have seen the revival of the fortunes of the Indian National Congress, which headed a mass national coalition to take on Modi and the BJP. And the fact that they doubled their seats from 5 years ago, up to 99, getting 99 seats, is really significant. And even, I would argue, a party like the Indian National Congress, which has been so discredited, so pilloried, and quite rightly so, particularly under the leadership of Rahul Gandhi. The fact that they were able to have successes is also quite extraordinary. The result is even more incredible when you think about the deep authoritarian nature of the Indian state, particularly in terms of the level of repression that has been meted out to those who oppose the BJP. And this is particularly in the form of repressive measures against leading politicians. So like in the run-up to the general election, in fact for a whole year or so, it was a constant feature that there would be a knock on an opposition politician's door at 4 a.m, 5 a.m, knocking on their door and detaining them, arresting them under all kinds of fictitious charges, usually to do with taxes, tax evasion and what have you. So in April, a month before the election actually got underway, the assets of the Indian National Congress were frozen on the basis of non-payment of taxes. In Delhi itself, the Chief Minister of Delhi, a man who leads one of the opposition smaller parties, Arvind Kejriwal, himself was arrested on charges of bribery, corruption, and so on. And of course, this was all designed to sap any sense of opposition that there could have been towards the BJP. So that was quite extraordinary. This level of authoritarianism, of course, also saw any kind of dissent being silenced, particularly in terms of media outlets, whether this was in the form of print media, broadcast media, or social media. They were completely and utterly demonised. All kinds of opposition groups were demonised, and of course they were demonised by a servile mainstream media that did the bidding of the BJP. A situation where virtually, I know that in Britain we all complain bitterly, and me most, about the BBC and how they give so much airtime to Farage, but you've got to try and imagine a scenario where it is Farage and nobody else for God knows how many years in order to get a glimpse of how servile the Indian media had been in the last decade towards the BJP. This result was also even more staggering when we think about the demonisation and the level of brutal hate that was unleashed throughout the election campaign. And here, of course, I'm talking about the targets of India's over 200 million Muslim population. The BJP and Modi himself made a name for himself back at the start of this century for being seen as the murderer of Gujarat, where as Chief Minister he presided over the demonisation of Muslims, complaining about Muslims, creating the narrative that has now become so dominant inside of the Indian social society that Muslims represent a fifth column. They're really Pakistanis in disguise. They are the enemy within. They have to be dealt with. And this narrative, of course, has continued in the last 10 years of the Modi regime. Modi himself, in April, referred to Muslims as infiltrators who had many children and claimed that they would take ordinary people's hard-earned money. Notice the term ordinary people, okay? This is a very, very favourite, popular right phrase that is used all the time. BJP politicians have described Muslims as being termites, with nobody within the media raising any kind of dissenting voice towards this. And of course, this vile rhetoric has had an impact throughout India, to such an extent that lynchings, and when I say lynchings, I'm not using this word lightly here, okay? There have been lynchings galore over the last decade of Muslims, particularly Muslim men, on the spurious grounds that, you're eating beef. You have entire neighbourhoods in so-called cosmopolitan cities like Mumbai and like Delhi and Calcutta, where Muslims are denied the right to purchase property, because if you are a Muslim, it's automatically assumed that you're going to be non-veg, and therefore that's the grounds that they use to deny you a residence, the ability to buy a place or to rent a place somewhere. And lynch mobs of Hindu fanatics, BJP supporters, and far worse, have roamed the streets hunting for Muslims on the basis of anything. Muslim men have been attacked. This whole notion that there is love jihad that is going on, whereby Muslim men are seen to be grooming and seen to be mauling decent Hindu women and what have you. And by the way, this isn't just something that's been happening to ordinary people. Even those who are billionaires in Indian society, when it comes to big, huge Bollywood stars, people like Shah Rukh Khan, who comes from a Muslim background, who himself is married to a leading Bollywood actress who happens to be from a Hindu background. He himself has been demonized and attacked over this. So not a single person from any kind of social background who has a Muslim heritage has been saved from this in any shape or form whatsoever. And so the violence and the level and the intensification of Islamophobia is unlike anything that we have witnessed so far in Europe. So it really is quite intense. And of course, under Modi's last 10 years, we now have a society in India where basically the notion that India is a Hindu state basically exists. He's only got to enshrine it into law, and there is a fear that this is going to happen in this term. Has really taken on a force of its own, and therefore the threat that this has represented to India's last 75 odd years or so of its supposed secular image as a democratic state is something that really is of enormous concern to people. And of course, in January of this year, we saw not only the completion of the building of the Ram Temple in the city of Ayodhya, but we saw the consecration of it, which was led by Modi, 31 years to the date of when the mosque that stood on that site, the Babri Mosque, had been torn to pieces, demolished by a frenzied Hindu mob. And of course, the consecration of this temple at Ayodhya is also signalling, and this has been again a constant narrative, that it wasn't just Ayodhya where there had been a temple, but the notion is, oh yes, this mosque here, there used to be a temple there, there used to be a holy shrine here, and there is a real fear across so much of India that there could be so many mosques that could be targeted. And it isn't just mosques. I mean, one of the complete and utter, moronic and hated figures of the Indian state, BJP leading member in UP, has even talked in terms of whether or not the Taj Mahal itself could have been some kind of former Hindu shrine, and what have you. The other thing, of course, that also makes the result in some ways quite extraordinary is that the attack and the demonisation of Muslims was also, of course, taking the form of legislation, particularly in terms of the BJP wanting to introduce an amendment to the citizenship laws, whereby they want to fast-track giving citizenship to anybody from the region of South Asia. So this includes the countries of Pakistan, of Nepal, of Bangladesh, of Sri Lanka, of Afghanistan, but it will be fast-tracked to anyone but a Muslim. So it's fast-tracked for Hindus, for Buddhists, for Christians, for Sikhs, but not if you're a Muslim. And of course, the other pernicious impact of this proposed amendment was also to start to eat away at the rights that Muslims have as citizens inside of the Indian state, to feed this fear that somehow they really are fifth columnists and therefore deserve to be treated as second-class citizens. The state of Kashmir has long, ever since independence, been a thorn in the side of the Indian state and also of the Pakistani state, because it has been, of course, the cause of so much tension. And in many respects, it's one of the unresolved aspects of the business of partition, because there was no consensus across the subcontinent as to what should happen to Kashmir. In the end, of course, it was awarded to India. But again, for so much of India's history under independence, Kashmir was accorded special status. The BJP in the last few years revoked that special status immediately. And not just that, but there is a huge level of repression that takes place inside of Kashmir. It's effectively under occupation of the Indian armed forces. The internet is switched off just like that. People are harassed, people are detained, people are arrested, thrown into jail, people are disappeared across that state with impunity in terms of what has been going on. The other thing that I think is also really quite significant about this result is where the BJP lost their votes. One of the states where they lost their votes was the northern state of Uttar Pradesh. And I am very proud of this because that is where my family hail from. And good old little, it's not so little, Uttar Pradesh, it is the most populous of the Indian states. Over 230 million people that live in that state. This is also the state that, of course, being in North India, is seen as being the cow belt, the Hindu belt, etc. It is seen as being the base of the BJP and the far-right the Hindu extremists who want to turn India into a Hindu state. And in that state, it was those that came from the lower classes, those that came from low-caste communities who turned their backs on Modi and voted against him. And this was summed up very beautifully by a farmer in the town of Muzaffarnagar in UP. He turned around, he was a very poor farmer. He said, previously we voted with blind faith for Modi, but now we're voting with our brains. And that, I think, really begins to give us a glimpse of how this, veneer of respectability, this veneer that, Modi is a man of the people who represents everyone, really began to be stripped apart in this election campaign. And I think this is very significant because it also gives us a sense of how this, the so-called economic miracle that India is supposed to be. This is how India is lauded all over the globe. Keir Starmer, one of the first messages of congratulations that he received in his election victory here came from Modi. And in that message, both of them were, saying to each other, yes, we look forward to greater economic cooperation, blah, 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 blah. Well, India's so-called economic miracle has not trickled down to the overwhelming vast majority of the people of the Indian state. And of course, for the last 10 years, this was the lie that the BJP had been able to sell the majority of people inside of India. And in this election campaign, it didn't work in the same way as it had done before. So I think this is also quite significant. The loss of, they also lost in the states of West Bengal and Maharashtra. And of course, the other thing is that the Indian stock market, because they also had bought into Modi, it nosedived on the day that the results began to come through. India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani, his net worth fell by $2.6 billion. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, his fortune slumped from nearly $100 billion to just under $80 billion. So, we have to feel really sorry for these scumbags, okay? And when we think about why people turned against Modi, it's not that difficult when you just look at some of the hard statistics of what reality is like in India. 2/3 of Indians live in rural areas. 45% of the population rely upon the agricultural economy for their labour. But the agriculture only contributes 15% of GDP. GDP has grown, but it's only grown by 8%. Unemployment is absolutely massive. In April, it stood at just over 8%. And to give you a sense of how desperate the situation is, a few years ago, there were 35 vacancies on the Indian Railways. Do you want to know how many people applied for that job? 35 million. Okay? So, and this was a few years ago. It's got a lot worse since then. Okay? In Delhi, the capital, in South Delhi, where my mother comes from, there's an area in South Delhi which they call Labour Chowk, where you have labourers who just sit there crouched on all fours like this, hoping that they'll get a day's work for $8 a day. Many of these are people who have migrated into Delhi because they come from farming families, they come from peasant stock, and they don't want to be working in agriculture because it's crap. They aren't able to make a livelihood in any shape or form, so they come to the city hoping to get some work. And these are not all unskilled people. Many of them are skilled. They are carpenters, they are painters, they are decorators, but they can't get regular work. Unemployment amongst students is absolutely sky high. 42% of graduates are not able to get a job in India. Okay. Now this is a colossal indictment of 10 years of Modi rule. Okay, and I think it's really important for us to have a sense of this in order to try to understand what were the intricacies at work that have produced the decline in support for Modi. Now, of course, they've set up a coalition government, but this coalition is something which is not that stable. All right, they've managed to cobble together a coalition with two small parties, but these two small parties are secular. Right, that's number one. So they're not really signed up to Modi's deep Hinduized version of an Indian state, and there are going to be all kinds of squabbles, all kinds of fallings out that are going to happen, and I suspect they're going to be sooner rather than later. The other thing about these two parties, the Janata Dal Party and the Telugu Desam Party, is that they've also done deals in the past with Congress and with other parties, okay? So this is not an alliance based upon any kind of principles in any shape or form. And I think that this is going to signal perhaps greater instability for the Indian state. The head of India, Microsoft, put it really well. He said that, when you look at the statistics that I mentioned earlier on, he said what this demonstrates, and the result demonstrates, is that amongst young people, they care more about jobs and prosperity than they give a toss about religion and temples. And that is something that I think, not only we should take heart from, but it is also an important lesson for us to think about when it comes to the elections that we are facing across Europe and elsewhere. The Indian Microsoft boss also said that for India to become anywhere near a stable, growing economy, the Indian state would have to put 12 million people per day into jobs. Okay, you just imagine that. They've got to get 12 million people per day have got to be put into jobs. So the problems for Modi in terms of trying to solve the crisis of the Indian state and the Indian economy are absolutely huge. Modi says that he wants to now help to build a manufacturing base for India. The manufacturing base of the Indian state is just 3%. Modi has said that by the time we get to 2047, which will be the centenary of independence, he wants to raise this to 10%. But to do that requires massive investment within the infrastructure of Indian society, okay? And it just it's not going to happen, all right? And when I say infrastructure, there are large swathes of India which don't have regular electricity supplies. There are large swathes of Indians who don't have regular gas supplies. There are large areas of India where sanitation, where housing is really piss poor. And in order to turn India into a truly westernized global economy, a huge amount of investment is required. And the likes of these two rich scumbags in India, who've been so close to Modi, they are not prepared to make that kind of investment any more than someone like Richard Branson or James Dyson or the bloody Hinduja family would be willing to invest inside of the British economy. So there are problems ahead for this, okay? And I think we have to keep this in mind. The other thing I want to say very quickly is just about the left. I'm not going to be able to say much about this, but just to say that the Indian left historically has been dominated by the Communist Party tradition, and they were part of the coalition that was cobbled together, which was good. It was good to see people being united to oppose Modi. But the results were not that great for them. The two states where they had dominated, West Bengal, they've only got one seat in West Bengal, and not only that, but the BJP have 12 seats in West Bengal. Kerala, which was the first state to return a communist MP in the so-called free world in the late 1950s, they now only have one seat that they won in this election, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and the BJP have made their first breakthrough by winning one seat in the state of Kerala. So this should also present a warning to us about what is going on here, and therefore what needs to be done. Because obviously, and I'm going to conclude on this, there is the trend of the far right growing, and there is a real fear of this. This is a serious challenge to us on the left that we have to meet. And in India itself, people have been attempting to challenge Modi, and in many respects, very, very courageously. But I think that there are questions and issues about the kind of strategy that they have been employing, and also in terms of how they identify what the chief problem is in India. Because I would argue that you can't really beat Modi in a game of parliamentary elections. Okay, if you attempt to fight Modi on that basis alone, I don't think this is going to work. And there is a question of how the Indian left is going to attempt to rebuild on the ground in India. So that's something I'm sure we can come back to in the discussion. But the other thing I would emphasise is that Modi is not invincible. The fact that he hasn't got the majority shows that they can be pushed back, shows that they can be fought, and we can organise against them. And this is extremely important for us on the left here, because we obviously have our own job to do here, but it's also important to recognise that we are not alone in terms of seeing a growth of a far right. And Modi, of course, was the first hard man of the far right, but we saw in their general election result that he got a little bit of a bloody big kicking, and that was really good. And we've got to make sure that we keep on kicking and we throw the bastards into the Arabian Sea.
I myself come from India, from Punjab, and from a farming family. And in fact, 3 years ago, the Indian farmers had already proven that Modi is not so invincible. People may remember that hundreds of thousands of farmers protested for nearly 18 months outside on the borders of Delhi. They set up camps, and they stayed there for nearly 18 months. And 700 farmers had died, mainly because of the exposure to elements and also some accidents. But in the end, they made Modi to bend his knees in front of them, and he was forced to repeal 3 very dangerous anti-farmer laws. And on the same day when the Punjabi farmers started their protest, they left in the Punjab in thousands of trolleys and tractors and other vehicles. And on the same day, 200 Indian workers went on a one-day general strike, and but unfortunately the Indian workers were unable to have their 4 anti-trading laws repealed. I don't have time to go through that, but unfortunately also the Indian farmers' leaders, they decided to fight state elections, which are coming soon. So they left some very important of their demands on the negotiating table when they rushed back to their villages to stand in elections. I'll just give you one example. The main Punjabi farmers' leader was an 80-year-old man, and he was already dreaming about becoming a chief minister of Punjab, like the first minister in Scotland and Wales. And when he used to hold his mass rallies at the height of the farmers' protest, he got 100,000 people in front of him, but when he called a mass rally for the election campaign, there were only 2,000 or 3,000 sitting in front of him, and that's on the view. And I knew immediately that it's all over for them. And then the Punjabi farmers stood 171 candidates in every single constituency, and every single of their candidates lost their deposit by this left-wing party who were no longer left-wing, they were left-wing at the time. So they thought not only about the farmers' concern, but also general social concerns as well. And they had a landslide victory. Thank you. So it proves that it's not important to fight elections, but the struggle is more important. Thank you.
The last speaker actually touched on some of what I was just going to ask, because I was thinking back to the amazing struggles of the farmers that we all saw on the TV, but I just wanted to ask for a bit more on the other industrialised workers that been in the tech industries and elsewhere, how they're organised, how well they're doing, and just in the 2-minute discussion we were having, I understand the trade union federations are linked to political parties, and if that's how that holds them back, or what have you. Just linking to the last point Talat made, that it's not the elections alone that are going to defeat Modi. So yeah, prospects for industrial workers.
Well, I want to make a couple of points. First of all, it's very important to say that the Hindu chauvinism represented by Modi is also leaching into British politics. And it's a factor we have to sometimes address. I live in Leicester, I run the University College Union branch at Leicester University. We had clashes between groups of Hindus and Muslims on the streets of Leicester a few months ago. I'm very proud to say that our UCU branch went beyond what most of the left said, which is we want calm and multiculturalism. And of course we want calm and multiculturalism, but we also condemned the penetration of Hindutva chauvinist politics onto the streets of Leicester, promoted by figures like Modi. And that was a hard argument in my union branch, because you're talking to people who don't necessarily, like myself and Talat, come from a South Asian background. You have to explain the politics. So we need to understand the way this is affecting politics in Britain. The second thing the point I want to make is we can't respond to Modi simply with a disabling argument that says, oh, the fascists are in power in India now, it's a fascist takeover. Because that's completely demobilising. If you actually had a fascist regime in India, there'd be no opportunity for resistance. And as we've just heard, there are lots of spaces of resistance. The left can resist in India. We have to have a more sophisticated explanation, and we have to talk about the limitations of Congress's politics in the post-war period. You had a politics based on a national model of development that ran up against the buffers, and as it ran up against the buffers, you saw Congress increasingly leaning on communalism themselves, increasingly toying with Hindu chauvinism, and increasingly toying with neoliberalism in that period. That opens up a space in which people like Modi and the BJP can radicalise that agenda, take it even further to the right, in alliance with sections of Hindu capitalism, the turbocharged sections around the IT industry, finance and so on. That's what Modi represents, and therefore we have to say, simply reverting to forms of nationalism, forms of neoliberalism associated with Congress, or associated with the communist parties in India is not enough. We need a politics based on the finest traditions of class struggle from below and a genuine revival of that left tradition. And that's what points the way towards real hope and real possibilities of change in India, which break with the BJP, but also break with the bankrupt Congress tradition in India.
I just want to say thank you firstly for the talk. It's very informative. I know I came late, but everything mentioned when I did come was very interesting. I didn't know much about that as well.
13 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Before I want to say anything, I firstly want to say that I myself am a Kashmiri, and I've been with Kashmir for basically since birth, and I've also sent Palestine as well. I just want to talk a bit more about Kashmiri people as well. Since 2019, there has been kind of media and a blackout. I have a lot of friends in the part of Kashmir who have not had contact with since that blackout went, and many of them have either fled the country to other countries, and we're now seeing a diaspora in Jammu and Kashmir, but some of them have actually either taken up arms to fight against Indian occupation because of the fact that they have lost family members, and they have lost family members to death or to kidnapping, and they have no idea where they've gone. And we are seeing little media come out of Kashmir because of everything that's going on. And after Modi had revoked Article 370 and took away what little ingenuity and self-determination that the Kashmiris had, you see this stark rise in settlements being imposed in the region, and you see industrialization being imposed in the region, a very agricultural region, and taking away the Kashmiris' right to self-determination. Immediately you see Modi calling Kashmir the crown of India, a place which did not belong to either Pakistan or India in the first place. When the partition happened, Kashmiris wanted to be their own people, and yet, because of British colonialism and because of Britain's disgusting tactics of putting power into those who are loyal and subservient to them, it was sold off to both parties, and that is a disgusting thing to happen to our people. And we still face occupation to this day. We still face brutalization, and Modi still imposes its fascist dictatorial rule. And I want to say now that we fought for all struggles here, and we fight for Palestine as well here. We call for independent and free Palestine, and the Palestinians and Kashmiris also side by side because their struggles have been going on for the same time, and we have the same struggles going on as well. I am privileged to not have to face those struggles in Kashmir myself. But the question I want to ask is, if we're going to be going against Modi and destroying Hindu fascism and breaking it apart, what comes after? What does that mean for a free and independent Kashmir and the rights of the Kashmiri people as well?
Yeah, just a question. I mean, seeing temperatures rise in parts of India to over 40 degrees, and that seems to be increasing, the duration of that sort of temperatures is lengthening. Is climate change and global warming, is that a feature in any of the politics of Modi or any of the other parties? To try and address that.
I think it's really terrifying as we all feel about what's going on in India. And I think the hate that's unleashed against the Muslims it may be already, but I think if not, it will affect other groups too, because the Hindu nationalism will affect other groups. My relatives in India are Catholics, and some are really scared that the violence can hit them too, while actually, I have some who think that, I mean, they're also affected by this stereotyping and hate against the Muslims and feel like they are better than the Muslims, unfortunately. But I'm quite scared that when you unleash hate against one group, it hits other groups too. And then I have one question for you, because as far as I know, the left in India is dominated by Maoists. And it has some historical reasons. I wonder if you could just say something about, is it dominated by Maoists because it's mainly a peasant country, or has been? Or, I mean, what are the conditions to get other kinds of left groups up that are, hopefully, our tradition in the IST, but more Marxist?
I recently read a book called Hostile Homelands by Azad Essa, talking about the relationship between the Israeli regime, which we all know quite a lot about, and the Modi regime, and I wondered if you could just outline a number of matters in relation to that.
So, revolutionary greetings from India. I'm fresh off the boat, just got here in September. I come being part of the CAA and RC movement against the citizenship laws that Modi brought out, that we fought against, and which have been implemented now, and also part of the farm movement as well. So we think that we won, but states have implemented their own version of the farm laws, which Modi tried to bring in at the center. So BJP ruled states that are ruled by Modi's government have brought in these farm laws, and Adani and Ambani are capitalizing, and the farmers are still losing out. And as the comrade from Kashmir mentioned, the reality of Kashmir will still be the same. It will still be under occupation despite Congress or BJP coming to power, and the situation will still be the same. So what is required for Kashmir is complete revolutionary class struggle from the bottoms up to liberate it. And as the comrade mentioned here, Hindutva fascism is here as well in the UK. And if you look at the links between Rishi Sunak's wife, she comes from an Indian billionaire class from their family, and their family is invested, has been invested in Gaza as well. So the drilling rights for the oil in Gaza have been awarded to Infosys as well. They've got one part of the contract for that. They're handling the IT and tech stuff for this. And Adani also supplies drones to Israel. And while the rest of the world has been fighting to basically stop the supplies of weapons and arms going to Israel, India has been steadily supplying the Israeli regime to commit war crimes in Gaza by constantly sending arms, weapons, ammunition, the white phosphorus, all being sent from India, and the drones as well that are being used, also being sent and developed by Adani in India and being sent to Israel. And to be honest,
if you could sum up, please.
Yeah, to be honest, it's a grim reality regardless of whether the Congress or the BJP come to power, because at the end of the day, if you look at the statistics, Muslims are still going to be marginalized. Christians are also at the front as well of being marginalized. There have been numerous attacks on Christian churches as well, and it's a horrible situation, and the objective reality on the ground is not going to change, to be honest, and what is required is a revolutionary class struggle from the bottoms up. There's no faith and hope in electoral democracy when 90% of the population is radicalized and is basically believes in Hindutva fascism. They just vote for the Congress for their basically their class and caste interests. So India is deeply casteist as well. So when the Congress spoke about Modi losing out in Uttar Pradesh, Modi did not lose out to the secular class. He just lost out to the casteist class that Indians believe in, casteism, and the candidates that were put into contention against Modi, they were all upper castes, and it's the upper castes in Uttar Pradesh that have basically taken over.
I had a question about Modi in Israel, which kind of holds on from firstly what the Kashmiri comrade said, but the last couple of contributions. It's because when we think of Israel's collaboration with imperialism, we tend to think on the top level with the USA, and before that with Britain, but there's been a lot of low-level cooperation in the 70s and 80s with apartheid in South Africa, developing the nuclear bomb, and more recently with India. And I think Ahmed's book about Kashmir is very good, not just talking about the similarities between the occupation of Kashmir and the occupation of Gaza, but also the collaboration between the Indian ruling class, the Indian state, and the Israeli state. And the question is really, it is being argued by people like Ilan Pappé that we're seeing the end of Zionism, we're seeing the Israeli state in a deep crisis. To what extent does this impact on Modi and impact on India, that due to the close collaboration which we have, which the comment just said, will the crisis in Israel come over to a similar crisis in India, and particularly for Modi?
A few years ago, Modi was blacklisted by the US and Britain for his role as First Minister in Gujarat. And they seem to have reaccommodated him when he got national power. And ever since then, we don't seem to have had much criticism in the mainstream media in Britain of Modi and the Indian government. And it's just a comparison with China. China's always criticised, and rightly so, for its transgressions of human rights, but we don't hear the same about Modi and about Kashmir. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that the Western countries, particularly the US, but also Britain in the vanguard as well, are trying to break India from its non-aligned position, which India was a leading member of the non-aligned movement in the Cold War period, but now they're trying to encircle China and co-opt India into that situation. So you don't get criticisms of the Modi government. You get pictures of Joe Biden or Trump with Modi. You get pictures of Sunak, possibly Keir Starmer, who knows, with Modi, because they are trying to realign in terms of what happens, and we are in a position where that Hindu nationalism is being given free rein without much criticism outside the South Asian communities. It is a very live issue in South Asian communities. I come from Birmingham, and in Birmingham there are lots of people of Kashmiri descent who are protesting against all of these injustices, but it doesn't get mainstream coverage. But some things do get coverage. The Punjabi farmers got coverage, but also the COVID mishandling, because the Modi government was awful with COVID. Thousands and thousands of people unburied, left on the streets. The same thing to some extent with all the heat waves at the moment. These are the realities of people's lives, even for the urban middle-class Indians, which are just as many middle-class Indians as there are middle-class British people, or people who are getting by. And those people are insecure because this is an insecure society. It's a society which even the middle classes feel insecure in. There is real problems and real tensions in India because not everybody is winning in that system. We do need to help our Indian comrades build a left, but we also need to understand the big South Asian communities which are in our country and have made their home here, and help them understand these strikes, because it's not only Leicester, but certain hangovers in Birmingham where you get communalism as well.
I have a question concerning, I mean, the mistakes Modi might have done in restructuring the system in his own aim. So you mentioned the economic contradictions, etc., but what might he learn from this, or not, like from the election results? What might he change in strategy in terms of learning for his own aims in restructuring the state? And then the question is also what was about, like, how did he restructure the juridical system? And because also I asked this question also in terms, I'm German, so and one of our fears is how the AfD might restructure the juridical system once in power in certain regions in Germany. So this is the question: how did he restructure the juridical system, and how far did he get with this with the possible restructuring? Judicial. Sorry, my English.
I'd just like to say a few words about the Indian left, because there are 3 communist parties in India. Too complicated to describe that happen. It's simple. They all follow the sort of what you might call the popular French strategy of Joe Stalin. This is where the echo perhaps of what's going on in France at the moment. But it's the point to remember that these organisations over the past 8 decades have successively built huge followings in India. Not only their own memberships, but supporting organisations of workers, of agricultural workers, farmers, students, young people, in literally hundreds of thousands. Levels of support which revolutions in Britain and the rest can only dream about, through very bitter and brave struggles. But the issue comes not with that, but with the strategy. Because what actually happened was that all 3 communist parties, which won a total of 8 seats, but actually, the last time the BJP lost power in 2004, the communist parties won 42. So there's actually been, in those terms, a retreat. Now, the point about the multi-party front was that the best of these communist parties, the Communist Party of Liberation, come from a Maoist background, which is in the state of Bihar. This man called Nitish Kumar. They were actually sort of trying to operate around Nitish Kumar. But Nitish Kumar, as Talat mentioned, had already swapped sides 3 times. And surprise, surprise, 2 months before the election, he swapped sides a 4th time and actually delivered 30 MPs, directly or indirectly, to Modi. And the problem, I think the problem comes back, and it's been echoed in what's happening in France, is that by focusing on this kind of broad electoral front with people who actually aren't on your side, you actually demobilise yourself. And actually the struggle is actually going to be on outside Parliament, and actually for a class struggle, not focusing on elections.
Going back to the subject of Birmingham, because there is a group of older people of Indian background who sort of, a few years ago, around COVID, were demonstrating sort of BJP, pro-BJP. They were coinciding with the Kashmir demonstrations, and they were sort of saying, a bit like the Zionists saying, we're picked on, we're the victims. And it tends to, like I said, there's an older group of people of Indian background. But then a couple of years ago, there was a demonstration outside one of the Hindu temples because the Hindu temple had asked for a speaker to come and speak who turned out to be really horribly Hindu to us speak, awful Hindu to us speak, more like a neo-Nazi actually, even sort of like someone with a track record of having called for the extermination of Muslims and that kind of thing, to actually speak at the Hindu temple. There was protests outside by a group of young Muslim men, but it was fairly disorganised. So I sort of how should the left or how can the left intervene in that? Because there was actually no left intervention in that. It was just left to the sort of local Muslim men to come out and demonstrate against that. So that's a question I've got for you.
Just very quickly, 3 quick questions. On the judiciary, yes, the BJP have already made inroads into the way that the legal system operates, like they have on so many other fronts as well. You know, it's been their henchmen that they appointed from 2014 onwards, you know, to run the museums, to become directors of the National Archives, you know, in the same way that Trump appointed right-wing bigots onto the Supreme Court. This is exactly what Modi was doing way before Trump had even become president. And we are seeing this right now with Arundhati Roy, because she, you know, the courts have given the go-ahead for legal action to be taken against her for something that she said over 14 years ago, when she said that Kashmir is not necessarily integral to the Indian state. And of course, for Modi and the BJP and the hard right, they've been gunning for Arundhati Roy for absolutely decades. You know, she's been a big thorn on their side because she's been so principled and so courageous in standing up to them. So, you know, they have wormed their way in to try to reshape the institutions of the Indian state to attempt to serve their purpose. And so, you know, that definitely is going on. The question of climate change, you know, yes, the temperatures across the whole of South Asia are horrific. You know, so like every single year, and they are rising all the time. The key thing we've got to remember here, I'm not going to be able to answer this in full, is that, you know, outside of the West, the 2 biggest polluters on this planet are the Indian state and China. And, you know, and it is disgusting that Modi, and sadly some people even on the progressive left have gone along with this, you know, they wring their hands and say, oh, you know, but it's the West that are the biggest polluters, which, by the way, the Western states are, right? But of course then they use that as an excuse to really do very little and to say that, you know, we're from the global south, we've got to modernise our economy, etc., etc. But of course what they really mean by that is that they want to modernise it for the supreme minority elite, the top 1% of the population, which has accumulated over 40% of the wealth of the Indian state. They don't mean modernisation and improvements for the vast majority of Indian people, no matter who they are. You know, as far as they're concerned, they can just languish outside on streets and perish as they did under COVID. And you know, the question that was asked about sort of, you know, how there are many, you know, all minorities are under attack in India, and that is absolutely true. Of course, the key thing is that by demonising the degree to which they have demonised the Muslims is also a way to tell other communities that you've got to sign up to this, because if you don't, this is going to happen to you. And of course, you know, in many respects, it's actually quite shocking the degree to which, for example, amongst the Indian Sikh community, there really has been, if you like, a discipline of the Indian Sikh community ever since the murder and the assassination of Indira Gandhi, because of what Congress did back in the 1980s in Amritsar, to such an extent that, you know, the notion is that, you know, Sikhs, you belong to India because Sikhism is indigenous to India, but you've basically got to sign up to what the BJP credo is. And of course, this is also something that they've tried to do with low caste communities as well, and untouchable communities. And this is something that has to be fought tooth and nail everywhere that we are. But quickly on the question of the trade unions and what have you. Yes, you know, the trade unions are affiliated, by and large, to many of the political parties. Parties on the left, they certainly are. And sometimes they cooperate and unite, and sometimes they don't, you know, which is not a very good thing. But sadly, there are also trade unions which are affiliated to the far right in terms of the RSS, the Shiv Sena, the BJP, and that really is petrifying. But again, we've got to remember that what allows them to do that is precisely because of a vacuum that has existed for way too long by what I would argue is a piss-poor strategy and analysis by people who I've got a lot of time and a lot of respect for on the Indian left, but their failure to really learn the lessons from failed strategies, decade after decade after decade, which has produced Modi. And the fact that, even now, when they do this, enter this grand coalition with Congress, do they attack Congress for the fact that, Congress, although it could turn around and say, oh, we don't like the way that, there's this horrible witch hunting going on of the press and of politicians and of minorities. Well, very good. But Congress also turned around and said in the run-up to the election that they want to make India safe and secure for the Indian business community. Do the left that are part of this electoral coalition turn round and attack them with vehemence for saying this? No, they don't. And that's because they sadly are not learning the lessons of their own decrepit history in terms of tail-ending the nationalism and other things. And this sadly is true of whatever wing there has been of the Indian left. It's absolutely tragic that in a country like India that there hasn't been a genuine left that has emerged from below that could really begin to reshape the Indian left in a much better direction with much better politics, which is really what the Indian state needs. Okay, just a few other points here. Obviously Kashmir came up. And yes, when it comes to Kashmir, for Modi, they would, they've already gone part of the way there in terms of revoking the 370 article, okay? And they've also gerrymandered, but it isn't just Modi. Even Congress gerrymandered the state borderlines of the Kashmiri state and what have you. It was all been about trying to reduce the overwhelming majority of the population, of course, who are Muslim. You've had settlements for the last 20 years, 30 years of Hindu communities being encouraged to go into that valley, and the state has been divided. But what is really troubling is that for Modi and the BJP project, they really do want to make Kashmir Hinduized, because not only would that represent a gigantic victory for the politics of Hindu chauvinism and Hindu nationalism, but it would also be a further way of belittling the Muslims within the Indian society itself, and also, of course, having a huge pop at its so-called neighbour and opponent, the Pakistani state. Okay, and this brings me on to the whole question of the geopolitical alliances that are going on. Because yes, of course, it's true what everybody's saying about the connections, close connections between Israel and India. But that is not surprising, because India is very much part of the Western camp on so many fronts. Okay, why? Summed up in one word: China. Right? The fear that the Indian state has is on akin with the fear that the United States has about China as a global power. The Indian state sees itself as being a competitor. They want to be Asia's #1 economy, not the Chinese. So of course, they are fearful of that. They're also fearful because India and China have also gone to war, and there are still territorial disputes between India and China on its borderland. So it's obviously very much an alliance of, on the left people use the phrase intersectionality and intersections of interest. But I think we should talk about the intersections of the ruling class here, because they certainly are there. For the Indian state, their interests are aligned with the United States and the West, but they're also aligned with Israel. Now, this is partly to do, obviously, with defence contracts and what have you, but also, of course, because they see parallels in their own, disgusting mentality that, yes, Israel, you have a problem with your Muslims, we also have a problem with our Muslims. We've got to keep them under control. Yes, we've got to send the army in, etc., etc. But also, of course, the Indian state, just like the Arab ruling classes, they don't want to see victories for the Palestinians in the Middle East. Why? Because they know that it would send shockwaves throughout, not just the region of the Middle East, but also into South Asia, and it would help to destabilise in the states there, because people would begin to see alliances. So, so the intersections of our ruling classes we have to be fully aware of. Okay, I'm going to finish on these 2 points here. A number of people, when they spoke, used the word Hindu fascism. That is a meeting in and of itself. But I just want to say this. I don't think that's a particularly helpful way to characterise what we are talking about in terms of the BJP and the politics of Hindutva. That doesn't mean to say that, heaven forbid, at some future date, there cannot be the development of full-fledged fascism within India itself, but that's not where we are today by any stretch of the imagination. And so I don't think it's particularly helpful to talk about Hindu fascism. Joseph said it himself that if we were living under a fascist state, well, you couldn't talk about the farmers' protest. You couldn't talk about the protests that took place in Shaheen Bagh just before COVID and lockdown came. You couldn't talk about the level of people turning against Modi and the BJP in the elections and what have you. You would have stormtroopers absolutely everywhere. There would be a silencing of every single limited forms of freedom that we are permitted to enjoy under capitalism. So it is not fascism, but it certainly is Hindu, very, very extreme Hindu nationalism. And of course, when it comes to this country, we have a job to do in Britain, right? I think for the right have made inroads, both the right in terms of the politics that has been imported into Britain from the subcontinent and the impact that is having in areas like Leicester or in Birmingham. But it also means that this is a challenge for us on the left here, because we have to go into these communities. We can't leave these communities to the mercy of organisations like BJP supporters or the oh my goodness, I'm forgetting their names. It doesn't matter. You know what they are. We cannot leave these so-called cultural outfits that try to make out that they're just interested in promoting Hindu culture. We cannot leave Hindu communities to these people in any shape or form. We have to fight with them in the same way that our comrades did in Leicester. We have to challenge those sorts of ideas. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It isn't. But we have got to do this, okay? And we've also got to ensure that we're also taking up the arguments inside Muslim communities so that they don't see Hindus as being their enemy and Hindu communities don't see Muslims as being their enemy. Because when we talk about the rise of the far right, do you think they're really going to give a toss whether you pray to 1 million gods or to one fucking god? No, they are not, okay? You've got a different skin colour, you have a different heritage, you eat, funny food, etc., etc. They're going to be coming after all of us, and we have got to fight for these kinds of class politics. And so my final point is this. The Indian state, as we see it today, is brutalised capitalism, right? It is unfettered capitalism that we have been witnessing inside of that state. Because, of course, this is exactly what the ruling class want. That's how the likes of, the Ambanis and the Advanis of this world have made their bloody billions, and Sunak's wife and her family, etc. And they do this in exactly the same way as our own ruling classes do this in this country, right? Because they do not care about ordinary people. They don't care about the poor. They want to privatise everything and anything in order to enrich themselves. A couple of people said, we've got to build revolutionary struggles. We have got to build revolutionary struggles. But the best way that we can help our brothers and sisters and comrades in India is to ensure that we build an effective organisation, that we will build effective anti-racist organisations which are mobilised, which are broad, which are large, and that we build a genuine socialist tradition in this country, which hopefully can also be a way where we can have conversations with comrades in India to help to bring about the emergence of a genuine socialism from below that the Indian left and the Indian working classes and peasantry so desperately need.